The village was small, almost forgotten by time. Nestled between jagged cliffs and the shadowed expanse of an ancient forest, it seemed untouched by the chaos of the world beyond. Smoke curled lazily from chimneys, the scent of burning wood mingling with the crisp night air. Children played near the edges of the river, their laughter echoing softly across the still waters, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Yet, beneath this ordinary calm, something uneasy lingered. A whisper of wind would twist through the narrow alleys, carrying with it a faint, indecipherable murmur. The villagers, simple folk with simple lives, dismissed it as the forest breathing, or the cliffs groaning with the night. But some could feel it deep in their bones, a premonition, a warning they could neither name nor understand. Animals too sensed the disturbance. Dogs refused to leave their homes, and birds flew silently overhead, their wings cutting through the darkness like sharp knives. Even the river seemed restless, its surface occasionally rippling as though disturbed by something beneath. On the outskirts of the village, old stones jutted from the earth, relics of a forgotten time. Children avoided them, but the older villagers remembered the stories, tales of gods who once walked among men, now sleeping beneath the world, waiting. Few believed the legends, and fewer still dared to speak of them aloud. That night, as the moon rose over the village, casting long, distorted shadows across the cobblestones, a chilling stillness settled. It was the kind of quiet that presses against the chest, that makes the hairs on your neck stand on end. For in the calm before the storm, the world pauses, just long enough to let the darkness wake. And somewhere beneath the soil and stone, the first stirrings began. It began with a tremor, so subtle that most villagers dismissed it as the restless earth settling beneath the cliffs. But for young Eric, a curious and restless boy, it was impossible to ignore. Drawn by an inexplicable pull, he wandered beyond the village, to the edges of the forest where gnarled roots clawed through the soil like grasping hands. There, half buried beneath the tangled roots of an ancient oak, Eric found it, a stone unlike any he had ever seen. Black as night, yet pulsing faintly with a crimson glow, it seemed almost alive. The surface rippled under his fingers, and when he touched it, a shiver ran through him, a whisper, soft and urgent, curling through his mind. He recoiled, heart hammering, but the stone called to him. Not with words, but with something older, something ancient and hungry. The forest itself seemed to hold its breath. Leaves stilled, insects froze mid-flight, and the wind died. It was as though the world had noticed the stone had been unearthed. Eric ran home that night, unable to explain what he had found. But over the coming days, changes began to stir in the village. Shadows shifted where none should be, strange shapes danced at the edge of vision, and a faint humming, barely audible, filled the air. Some villagers dismissed it as imagination, but others, especially those who had listened to the old legends, felt the same dread that had gripped Eric, that something long asleep had begun to awaken. And the stone, it pulsed ever so slightly as if pleased by its discovery. That night, Eric dreamed of eyes in the darkness, countless and unblinking, staring from beneath the earth. He woke with a start, drenched in cold sweat, the whispering echo still lingering in his mind. Some discoveries, he would soon learn, are not meant to be found. The night fell heavier than usual, as though the sky itself had thickened to a suffocating black. Candles flickered in the windows of the village, their weak light barely holding back the shadows that slithered along the edges of the streets. The air was thick with unease, carrying a metallic tang that made throats dry and hearts pound. It began with the screams. A cry erupted from the outskirts, sharp and jagged, shattering the fragile quiet. Doors slammed, dogs barked and howled, and villagers poured into the streets, clutching whatever torches or tools they could find. But when they reached the source, the boy Eric, who had unearthed the stone, was gone. Only the whispering remained, soft and mocking, curling through the air like smoke. That night, the village felt the first brush of something truly inhuman. Shadows moved independently, twisting into grotesque shapes before vanishing into the darkness. Windows that were once opaque reflected not the villagers' faces, but strange, distorted forms, eyes glinting in the candlelight. And beneath it all, the faint hum of the stone pulsed, almost like a heartbeat, a rhythm that seemed to summon the darkness closer. Some villagers swore they saw figures, tall, impossibly thin, their limbs bending in unnatural ways, slipping silently between houses, only to disappear when looked at directly. Others heard whispers calling their names from just beyond the forest, voices dripping with malice, promising horrors no one could imagine. By midnight, more had vanished. Families huddled together, muttering prayers to gods they no longer believed in. Windows rattled as though something was pounding from the outside, yet the forest remained eerily still. The earth seemed alive with intent, shadows stretching unnaturally long, and the faint crimson pulse of the stone seemed to grow stronger, feeding on the fear it had awakened. By the first light of dawn, the village was changed. Doors hung crooked, livestock was scattered or dead, and a silence heavier than any nightfall settled. The first night of terror had passed, but it was only the beginning. Beneath the surface of the earth, something stirred. Something ancient. Something that had been waiting for this very moment. The morning brought little comfort. The air was thick with a damp, choking fog, curling through the village streets like a living thing. Villagers moved silently, eyes wide and restless, their faces pale with fear. No one spoke of sleep. Those who had tried awoke screaming from dreams of unseen horrors, visions of eyes staring from beneath the soil. It was old Marin, the village elder, who finally broke the suffocating silence. His hands trembled as he stepped into the square, gripping a weathered staff carved with symbols almost forgotten by time. "It has begun," he rasped, voice shaking. "The prophecy, the gods are waking." The villagers listened in stunned silence as Marin recounted the legends. Long ago, before memory itself, the gods had walked among men. They were beings of unimaginable power, neither wholly cruel nor benevolent, whose anger could erase entire settlements. When humankind grew reckless, the gods withdrew, sealing themselves beneath the earth, leaving behind whispers, omens, and artifacts that should never be touched. And now, Marin's voice dropped to a whisper that carried over the square, "Someone has disturbed the stone. The seal weakens. The slumbering gods, they will rise." Panic spread like wildfire. Some villagers begged Marin to destroy the artifact, to bury it deeper, to do anything. Others, driven by curiosity, or madness, whispered of touching it, of listening closer to its call. The stone, they realized, had begun to speak not just to Eric, but to the village itself. Its faint red pulse seemed to echo with their own hearts, entwining its awakening with their fear. As the day wore on, the whispers grew louder, threading through the wind, calling names, mocking those who resisted. Shadows twisted unnaturally, moving even in sunlight. Animals fled the village entirely, leaving silence in their wake. The prophecy was no longer just words in a book, it was living, breathing, and hungry. That evening, the villagers huddled in their homes, staring at the forest's edge, waiting for the inevitable. For the first time they understood, the gods were not myths. They were a storm, patient, eternal, and rising. And there was nothing they could do to stop what had begun. The morning brought little comfort. The air was thick with a damp, choking fog, curling through the village streets like a living thing. Villagers moved silently, eyes wide and restless, their faces pale with fear. No one spoke of sleep. Those who had tried awoke screaming from dreams of unseen horrors, visions of eyes staring from beneath the soil. It was old Marin, the village elder, who finally broke the suffocating silence. His hands trembled as he stepped into the square, gripping a weathered staff carved with symbols almost forgotten by time. "It has begun," he rasped, voice shaking. "The prophecy, the gods are waking." The villagers listened in stunned silence as Marin recounted the legends. Long ago, before memory itself, the gods had walked among men. They were beings of unimaginable power, neither wholly cruel nor benevolent, whose anger could erase entire settlements. When humankind grew reckless, the gods withdrew, sealing themselves beneath the earth, leaving behind whispers, omens, and artifacts that should never be touched. And now, Marin's voice dropped to a whisper that carried over the square, "Someone has disturbed the stone. The seal weakens. The slumbering gods, they will rise." Panic spread like wildfire. Some villagers begged Marin to destroy the artifact, to bury it deeper, to do anything. Others, driven by curiosity, or madness, whispered of touching it, of listening closer to its call. The stone, they realized, had begun to speak not just to Eric, but to the village itself. Its faint red pulse seemed to echo with their own hearts, entwining its awakening with their fear. As the day wore on, the whispers grew louder, threading through the wind, calling names, mocking those who resisted. Shadows twisted unnaturally, moving even in sunlight. Animals fled the village entirely, leaving silence in their wake. The prophecy was no longer just words in a book, it was living, breathing, and hungry. That evening, the villagers huddled in their homes, staring at the forest's edge, waiting for the inevitable. For the first time they understood, the gods were not myths. They were a storm, patient, eternal, and rising. And there was nothing they could do to stop what had begun. The village had changed. The sun rose each morning, pale and weak, unable to burn through the fog that clung to every building and pathway. But the light offered no comfort. The villagers moved like ghosts, their faces hollow, their eyes darting nervously to corners that seemed to shift with every glance. It began subtly at first. Shadows seemed wrong. They stretched too long, bent at impossible angles, and sometimes moved on their own, flickering just beyond the edge of vision. Children whispered of shapes that lingered at the forest's edge, watching them. Animals refused to enter the streets, their eyes wide with terror, and even the wind carried strange sounds, murmurs, sighs, laughter that belonged to no one. Then came the visions. One by one, villagers began to see echoes of the past, memories that weren't their own, moments of guilt and regret replayed in vivid, grotesque clarity. Old Marin, the elder, woke screaming one night, convinced he saw the village burning not as it was, but as it would become, ash and smoke filling the sky, the cries of children mingling with the thunder of unseen steps. Some villagers claimed they could hear voices, whispering secrets no one had ever spoken aloud. The names of ancestors, long dead, called from the darkness, demanding attention. And then the figures began to appear, vague, flickering, half-formed shapes that hovered just beyond reach. They were human and yet not, their eyes hollow, mouths twisted into silent screams. Eric, the boy who had found the stone, was particularly affected. At first, it was nightmares, visions of eyes beneath the earth, of hands clawing through soil, and of the stone pulsing like a living heart. But soon the visions came during waking hours. Shadows clung to him, whispering in a language he couldn't understand, pressing him to go back to the forest, to the roots where the stone slept. And every time he resisted, the whispers grew sharper, almost angry, as if the stone itself resented hesitation. The villagers tried to fight it. They huddled in their homes, bolted doors, and prayed. But prayer had no effect. The shadows mocked them, the whispers laughed, and the visions dragged the guilty and innocent alike into an unending nightmare. Secrets long buried in the hearts of men surfaced in grotesque clarity. Neighbors saw each other not as friends or family, but as versions of themselves distorted, greed, envy, betrayal, cowardice, all amplified in the shadows. One by one, the villagers who had ignored the old legends began to succumb. Some wandered into the forest, drawn by voices only they could hear and never returned. Others saw their own deaths play out before them in vivid detail, and in panic, did the unthinkable, breaking the fragile bonds of community and trust. Fear and suspicion festered, twisting neighbor against neighbor. Meanwhile, the stone pulsed beneath the earth, its crimson light feeding on fear, its whispers threading into the minds of all who remained. The line between reality and nightmare blurred. Nights grew longer, shadows deeper, and the forest itself seemed to inch closer, its roots stretching like tendrils into the village. By the end of the fifth night, the village was a place of ghosts, both living and otherwise. The air was thick with dread, the cries of the lost echoing faintly through fog and shadow. The villagers understood, too late, that the past they thought forgotten had never left. It had been waiting, sleeping beneath the earth, tethered to the stone, and now it was awake. And with the past stirring so violently, the awakening of the gods was no longer a distant threat. It was imminent. Night fell again, heavier than ever, as though the sky itself had been pulled down to crush the village. The fog pressed against the crooked houses, curling through streets and alleys like the fingers of something alive. Shadows stretched unnaturally, moving against the dim light of lanterns, and the whispering, soft at first, now surged like a storm in the villagers' minds. Then it began. The first sign was the air itself. The wind carried a strange, metallic scent, thick and choking, and the ground beneath the village trembled subtly at first, then violently. Trees twisted and snapped as if writhing in pain, their roots breaking free of the earth, exposing the black soil beneath. And from that soil the first glimpses appeared. They were shapes, massive and terrifying, barely visible through the swirling fog. Limbs impossible in length, bodies that shimmered and warped in the dim light, eyes that glowed like molten gold. The villagers screamed, but their cries were swallowed by the growing roar of the earth. The gods were waking. Eric, drawn as always to the stone, felt it thrumming beneath his feet, a heartbeat growing louder, faster, echoing in his skull. The whispers were no longer whispers. They shouted, commanded, demanded obedience. He could feel the ancient power pulsing through the village, through him, through everything. The sky began to fracture. Stars disappeared, leaving black voids, and the moon seemed to flicker as though it feared what was rising. Lightning crackled without clouds, striking the earth in impossible patterns, illuminating glimpses of the gods' forms. One towered above the village, a mass of shadow and light, its mouth a yawning abyss. Another moved with inhuman grace, its multiple eyes scanning the streets, locking onto those who dared flee. Villagers ran blindly, stumbling into one another, but nowhere was safe. Houses crumbled, cobblestones split, and the river boiled as if touched by fire. Some were swallowed by shadows that moved independently of any source, never to be seen again. Those who tried to pray found their words strangled in their throats, the gods' presence too vast, too ancient, too alien for mortal understanding. Marin, the elder, shouted incantations learned from legends too old to recall, but the words fell like ashes. Even he could feel the limits of mortal power. The gods were not spirits, not demons. They were forces of creation and destruction, indifferent to human morality, beyond fear, beyond reason. By midnight, the village was a chaos of fire, shadow, and terror. The stone pulsed brighter than ever, anchoring the awakening, feeding off every heartbeat, every scream, every flicker of despair. And as the villagers' courage faltered, as the brave and the foolish alike were consumed, a horrifying truth settled over the survivors. The gods were no longer sleeping, and humanity was nothing more than an insect in their path. And far beneath the forest, hidden from mortal eyes, the others stirred. Eyes opened that had not blinked for millennia. The awakening had begun, and it would not end. By the following dawn, the village was unrecognizable. Streets once cobbled with care were now jagged paths of rubble, torn as if some colossal hand had ripped through the earth. Houses lay shattered, their walls splintered, roofs collapsed, and fires burned unchecked, casting flickering shadows that danced across the remnants of life. The survivors stumbled through the chaos, faces streaked with soot and tears, eyes wide with disbelief. Many were silent, stunned by the scale of the destruction. Others cried out, their voices swallowed by the oppressive roar of the awakening gods. The air itself seemed alive, vibrating with a low, omnipresent hum that pressed into the chest and mind alike. Eric ran through the ruins, searching for anyone familiar, anyone who had survived the night. But each corner revealed new horrors. Villagers turned to shadows themselves, their forms distorted and stretched, eyes glowing unnaturally, whispering secrets no one wished to hear. Some were consumed by the gods' presence entirely, leaving only screams that faded into silence. Even the forest encroached upon the village. Trees, twisted and alive, reached into streets, pulling at debris and bodies alike. Shadows crawled along the ground, moving independently of light, swallowing those who lingered too long. Rivers boiled and hissed, spilling black water that carried whispers of the dead. In the village square, Marin stood on the cracked stones, staff raised, chanting desperately. His voice wavered, nearly drowned by the wails and groans that filled the air. Behind him, a massive silhouette moved, one of the gods fully risen, towering, indifferent, its golden eyes scanning the ruined village. Every heartbeat of the stone beneath the forest echoed through the square, synchronizing with the rhythm of fear and destruction. The survivors attempted to flee, but the village had become a trap. Streets looped back on themselves unnaturally, doors led to nothing but walls or the dark void of the forest, and shadows followed relentlessly. Every escape route seemed orchestrated by unseen hands, guiding them toward the inevitable. And as the sun dipped below the fractured horizon, painting the sky with deep crimson, Eric understood the terrifying truth. The gods had not come to destroy everything out of malice. They had come to awaken fully, and the village, humanity, was merely the first step in their return. Those who remained clung to hope, however thin, whispering prayers and promises, but in the pit of their souls each knew, some nightmares are too vast, too ancient to outrun. The village had fallen. Its ruins were alive with terror, and the gods had only just begun their reckoning. The few who had survived the night gathered in the remnants of the village square, hearts pounding, breaths ragged. Flames from burning houses cast jagged shadows that writhed across the cracked stones, and the air carried a heavy metallic scent, the blood of animals, of men, and of something far older. Marin, trembling yet resolute, laid out the remnants of an ancient ritual. The instructions were simple in theory but impossible in practice. The gods could only be slowed, perhaps driven back into slumber, if the villagers offered a sacrifice of fear and courage together. The stone, pulsing now brighter than ever, had to be contained, its energy focused into the ritual circle. The survivors hesitated. Some wept, others trembled with terror. The stone called to them, its whispers insinuating itself into their minds, promising power, knowledge, release from fear, if only they surrendered. But surrender meant becoming one with the darkness, and none could bring themselves to do it. The ritual began. Marin chanted words that had not been spoken in a millennium, hands shaking, voice straining against the oppressive roar of the awakened gods. The survivors formed a circle, holding the stone aloft, their combined fear and defiance feeding the spell. The air thickened, vibrating with a deafening hum, and shadows recoiled at the flickering light of their determination. And then the gods appeared in full. Colossal, twisting forms, their limbs bending impossibly, eyes glowing with molten gold. Their presence pressed down on the village like an invisible weight, flattening resolve and scattering courage. One of the gods bent its head, gazing at the ritual circle, and the ground trembled beneath its attention. Some villagers faltered. They screamed, broke the circle, and were consumed instantly by the shadows. Others held firm, focusing on the ritual, feeling their fear transform into raw power, a defiance that even the gods could not ignore. The stone pulsed violently, almost as if alive, feeding on the desperate energy. 4 hours, or perhaps minutes, time seemed to distort, humanity and godhood clashed in a silent, invisible war. Flashes of reality bent and cracked. The sky tore open, glimpses of endless voids beyond appeared, and whispers promised eternity to those who would give in. Finally, with a scream that split the air, the stone erupted in crimson light, forcing the nearest god backward into the earth. The ritual had partially succeeded. One god was banished for now. The others recoiled, yet their eyes remained fixed on the village, hunger and curiosity simmering beneath the surface. Exhausted, broken, trembling, the survivors clung to one another. Victory was temporary, fragile, and incomplete. They had fought back the darkness, but the gods were not gone. They were merely waiting, patient and eternal. And from the shadowed corners of the village, whispers echoed once more, reminding them that the storm had not ended. The last stand had been made, but the war was far from over. Dawn came, pale and hollow, as if even the sun feared to rise fully over the ruined village. The streets were silent, save for the occasional groan of shifting rubble or the soft hiss of fire burning out of control. Smoke curled lazily into the gray sky, carrying with it the scent of ash, blood, and something older, something that belonged to neither earth nor man. The survivors huddled together, exhausted, trembling, and forever changed. Some could no longer speak, their minds had been scarred by what they had seen. Others stared into the distance, eyes wide with a realization too terrible to voice. The gods were not gone. Their forms had receded, yes, banished temporarily by the desperate ritual, but their presence lingered like a shadow over every stone, every tree, every breath. The whispers began again. Soft at first, almost comforting, curling through the fog. But soon they became sharp, insistent, crawling into minds with cruel precision. Names were called, some real, some imagined, and memories long buried rose from the depths. The villagers knew then that nothing was safe. Even in silence, even in hiding, the god's reach was eternal. Eric walked among the ruins, drawn once more to the stone, which pulsed faintly beneath a mound of dirt and debris. Its crimson light was subtle now, almost seductive, promising knowledge, power, release, if he dared touch it again. He recoiled, knowing instinctively that the story was not finished. Some darkness could never be destroyed, it could only be delayed. And far beneath the forest, far from mortal eyes, the other gods stirred. Eyes opened that had slept for eons. Limbs flexed and stretched, testing the limits of the world above. They had tasted awakening, and the memory of it burned like fire in their consciousness. They were patient, eternal, and unstoppable. The village would be rebuilt, perhaps. But the whispers in the void would remain, threading into the hearts of those who survived, haunting dreams, twisting thoughts, and waiting. For the gods were not done, they never would be. And one day the stone would call again. The survivors understood one undeniable truth: some nightmares never end. They only wait, whispering in the dark, ready to return. And in that silence, heavy and suffocating, the void waited too.